He left her in a hospital bed with the words "it's over." 2 years later, he walked into a cafe, and saw her holding the daughter who had his eyes. The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and despair, its white walls pressing in on Emma as she lay motionless on the bed, her skin pale against the sheets. Machines hummed softly in the background, reminding her with every beep how fragile life had become. Michael stood by the window, his tall frame rigid, his face hidden in shadow as if he could not bear to look at her. When he finally turned, his blue eyes were cold, a storm brewing behind them, and Emma searched for even the smallest trace of tenderness she once knew. But instead of comfort, instead of the promise that he would stay, his voice cut through the silence like a blade. "It's over," he said, each word deliberate, each one shattering something inside her that she didn't think could still break. Emma tried to speak, to ask him why, but her throat tightened, and no sound came out. Her heart screamed louder than any words could. She had believed in him, believed that even in her weakest moment he would not abandon her. She wanted to reach for his hand, to stop him from leaving, but her arm felt too heavy, her body too fragile, and all she could do was watch as the man she loved drew further away with every heartbeat. He didn't see the tear that slid down her cheek, or perhaps he chose not to see it, because he had already convinced himself that turning his back was the only way to survive. The echo of his footsteps lingered long after he walked out the door, and the emptiness he left behind filled the sterile room with an unbearable silence. Emma's chest rose and fell unevenly as she pressed her trembling hand against her stomach, not yet knowing the secret that would change everything. Somewhere deep within her, a new life had begun, a fragile spark of hope that would grow even as her world seemed to collapse. She closed her eyes, letting the darkness swallow her, clinging to the faintest thought that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end she had been forced to believe in. The city lights had long since faded in Emma's memory by the time she found herself living in a small, weathered apartment on the outskirts of a town where no one knew her name. Those first months had been unbearable, filled with sleepless nights when fear and uncertainty pressed so heavily on her chest that she thought she might suffocate. Yet through the exhaustion and the endless battles with loneliness, there was always one reason for her to rise each morning. When she looked into the crib and saw the tiny girl with wisps of brown hair curling softly against her head and eyes the purest shade of blue, she felt a fragile sense of strength surge through her. She named her Lily, a name that spoke of both innocence and resilience, and promised herself that no matter how hard the days became, she would not let despair take away her ability to love her child. Life was far from kind. Emma worked long hours in a quiet diner with greasy floors and the smell of fried food clinging to her clothes, returning home each night with aching feet and barely enough money to pay for the electricity bill. The stroller she pushed through the streets was secondhand, its wheels squeaking at every corner, and her coat was worn thin against the cold. Some evenings she sat by the window while Lily slept, staring at the shadows on the wall and remembering the man who had once told her it was over. In those moments her heart tightened with a mixture of anger and sorrow, because she wanted to hate him for his abandonment, but every time she saw her daughter's eyes, she was reminded that his presence still lived in her life, etched forever into the child's face. Despite the heaviness of her struggles, Emma discovered new pieces of herself in the role of a mother. She learned how to calm Lily's cries with lullabies she never knew she could sing, how to find laughter in the smallest gestures like the clumsy reach of a little hand or the sound of her baby's giggle. There were nights when hunger gnawed at her stomach because she gave her portion of food to Lily instead, and days when she carried the weight of shame for the debts she could not repay, yet none of it mattered when her daughter smiled at her as though she were the whole world. That gaze, filled with trust and light, made Emma believe that perhaps survival was not enough, perhaps she was meant to build a future out of the ashes of her pain. 2 years passed like this, each day blurring into the next, filled with sacrifices and small victories that only she and her daughter would ever understand. By the time Lily was toddling around on unsteady legs, calling out "Mama" with a voice that melted away every wound, Emma had grown stronger, though the scars of her past still throbbed whenever she thought of what had been lost. She no longer dreamed of the hospital or the man who left her behind, telling herself it was better to bury those memories in silence. What she didn't realize was that life had a way of forcing the past and the present to collide, and the little world she had built for the two of them would soon be shaken by a presence she thought she would never face again. The day had begun like any other, with Emma hurrying through her morning routine, dressing Lily in a faded yellow dress that had been passed down from a neighbor, and preparing herself for another long shift at the cafe. The small place smelled of roasted coffee beans and warm pastries, its mismatched chairs and scratched wooden tables giving it a kind of charm that made customers return, even if the service was slow. Emma had grown accustomed to the rhythm of the cafe, the clinking of cups, the hum of the old espresso machine, the chatter of strangers who didn't know her story. To her, it was a safe cocoon, a space where she could earn just enough to cover rent and diapers, and where nobody asked about her past. That morning she had seated Lily in the corner at a small table near the window, with a coloring book and a handful of broken crayons to keep her busy, while she moved from table to table with a practiced smile. The bell above the door jingled as it always did when someone came in, and Emma, balancing a tray of empty mugs, didn't bother to look up at first. But then the room seemed to shift, her chest tightening as if some unseen force pressed against her. She glanced toward the door, and her heart froze. Standing there, framed by the sunlight pouring in from the street, was Michael. Time folded in on itself, 2 years dissolving in a single breath as she took in the familiar sight of his tall figure, the well-tailored suit that spoke of success, and above all, those piercing blue eyes that had once told her everything and then told her nothing at all. Emma's knees weakened, and for a moment she thought she might drop the tray, but she forced herself to keep moving, to pretend she hadn't seen him. Perhaps it was a cruel trick of fate, a hallucination born from exhaustion. But when she looked again, he was still there, scanning the cafe with a distant expression, until his gaze landed on the little girl at the corner table. Emma watched as his face transformed, confusion flickering into shock, and then into something unspoken that rooted him to the spot. Lily had looked up from her coloring, her bright blue eyes meeting his across the room, eyes so unmistakably his that denial was impossible. The air seemed to thicken as Michael's steps carried him closer, his polished shoes tapping softly against the worn floorboards. Emma's pulse roared in her ears, and she wished desperately to shield her daughter from his gaze, to hide her away before the truth became undeniable. But Lily, innocent and unburdened by the pain of the past, simply smiled and tilted her head, curious about the stranger who seemed unable to look away. Michael stopped beside the table, his hand trembling slightly as if he were reaching for something he no longer believed he deserved. He turned his head slowly, his eyes locking onto Emma, and in that instant she saw the recognition in his stare, saw him piecing together what she had fought so hard to keep hidden. Emma's body screamed at her to flee, to grab Lily and run as far as she could before he could say a word. Yet her feet would not move, her hands gripping the tray so tightly her knuckles whitened. She saw his lips part, his chest rise with the sharp intake of breath, and she knew that whatever came next would shatter the fragile world she had built. For 2 years she had lived with the ghost of his absence, convincing herself that the past was behind her, but here he was, flesh and blood, standing before the daughter he had never met. The cafe's noise faded into a blur. The laughter of customers, the hiss of the coffee machine, the scrape of chairs against the floor, all of it fell silent beneath the weight of that moment. Emma felt stripped bare, her secrets exposed without a single word spoken. Lily giggled suddenly, holding up a crayon drawing with clumsy pride, and Michael's gaze softened as though the world around him had narrowed to nothing but this child. He whispered something under his breath, too low for Emma to hear, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. He was not the man who had walked out of that hospital room, he was someone who had just discovered that the life he thought was gone had been standing before him all along. Emma's throat tightened as she forced herself to take a step toward them, knowing she could not stop what was unfolding. The fragile wall she had built to protect her heart, to protect her daughter, was crumbling, and with it came a storm of fear, anger, and the faintest glimmer of something she had long ago buried: hope. Emma's hands shook as she carried the tray back to the counter, but her eyes never left Michael, who now stood frozen by the little table where Lily sat swinging her small legs. She could feel the heat of his gaze burning into her, demanding answers she had no intention of giving in front of strangers. The cafe suddenly seemed too small, its walls closing in on her, and when Michael finally spoke, his voice was rough, edged with disbelief. "Is she, your daughter?" The words hung in the air between them like shards of glass, each one threatening to cut her open. Emma's breath caught in her throat, and for a heartbeat she thought of lying, of pretending that Lily belonged to someone else, anyone else, but then Lily lifted her face with innocent trust and Emma knew there was no lie in the world that could conceal the truth written in her child's eyes. Emma set the tray down with more force than she intended, the cups rattling against one another, and she met his stare with a mixture of anger and exhaustion. "You told me it was over," she said quietly, her voice trembling but steady enough to carry the weight of 2 years of silence. "You walked away without looking back. Did you think I would run after you? That I would beg you to stay?" Her hands curled into fists at her sides as memories of the hospital room washed over her, of the moment when her body was weak and her heart even weaker, and he had chosen to vanish rather than face what he feared most. She should not have had to grow up without a father, but I couldn't let her life depend on someone who had already abandoned us. Michael flinched as though her words were a physical blow. His jaw tightened, and for the first time Emma noticed the cracks beneath his polished exterior. He wasn't the untouchable businessman she remembered, not the man who always seemed in control. There was guilt etched into every line of his face, a heaviness in his shoulders that suggested he had carried more than she had ever guessed. "You don't understand," he said, his voice breaking in places he couldn't disguise. "That night at the hospital, they told me you wouldn't make it. They said you were fading and there was nothing I could do. I couldn't bear to watch you die. I thought leaving was the only way to survive losing you." For a moment Emma could only stare at him, her chest tightening with disbelief. The confession hit her harder than she expected, peeling back the layers of her anger and revealing a raw ache beneath. She wanted to scream at him, to tell him that his cowardice had cost her sleepless nights and endless tears, but part of her also recognized the pain in his voice, the fear that had driven him to run. She pressed her hand against the edge of the counter, grounding herself in the present, because she could not afford to let his words undo the strength she had built over the years. "You thought leaving was easier than facing me," she whispered, her voice brittle. "Do you have any idea what it was like to carry her alone? To hear her laugh and see your eyes looking back at me every single day, knowing you weren't there? You chose to escape, and I had no choice but to stay." Her body trembled with the force of emotions she had locked away, the bitterness and grief spilling out into the open for the first time. Michael closed his eyes for a long moment, and when he opened them again, they were wet with tears he refused to let fall. "I was a coward," he admitted, his tone stripped of pride. "I let fear make my choices. And because of that, I missed her first breath, her first steps, every part of her I should have been there to see. But don't think for a second that I don't regret it. Every day since I left, I've hated myself for not being stronger, for not fighting for you." The room seemed to fade away until it was just the three of them, Emma, Lily, and Michael, bound together by a truth none of them could escape. Lily's soft humming as she colored on the page in front of her seemed almost surreal against the storm of emotions filling the air. Emma wanted to shut it all out, to protect the fragile world she had created, but a part of her couldn't ignore the way Michael's voice cracked when he spoke of the moments he had lost. He wasn't the man who had left her anymore, at least not entirely. He was something broken, something flawed, and perhaps something that still longed to be repaired. Emma turned away before he could see the tears threatening her own eyes. She gathered Lily into her arms, holding her close as if to shield her from the man who had once shattered everything. "Whatever you regret doesn't change the fact that you weren't here," she said, her tone firm even as her heart trembled. "She doesn't know you. You're just a stranger who walked in from the past." Michael took a step closer, his voice low but urgent. "Then let me change that. Please. Don't let my mistakes define her life. Don't let my fear be the reason I lose both of you forever." His words carried desperation, a plea that reached past Emma's anger and touched something deeper, though she fought to ignore it. In that moment Emma realized that the past had come back not only to haunt her but to demand a choice she wasn't ready to make. She could keep running from the man who had hurt her, or she could face the possibility that people, even those who had once broken her heart, were capable of change. As she held Lily tighter, Emma's mind screamed with conflict, her body caught between the instinct to protect and the yearning for something she wasn't sure she could trust again. Michael's presence did not fade after that day in the cafe. He returned again and again, sometimes lingering outside until Emma finished her shift, other times finding excuses to sit at a corner table for hours with a cup of black coffee growing cold in front of him. At first she resented him for it, resented the way his shadow fell across the fragile world she had built, but slowly she began to notice that his persistence was not born of arrogance or control as it once might have been. It came instead from a quiet desperation, a need to repair what he had shattered, and perhaps to find a way to become part of the life he had missed. He didn't press her with demands, nor did he argue when she shut the door in his face. He simply kept showing up, kept leaving small signs that he was trying, whether it was groceries discreetly placed on her doorstep or bills mysteriously disappearing from her pile of debts. Emma struggled with conflicting emotions. Every instinct told her not to trust him, not to fall for gestures that might dissolve the moment things became difficult again. Yet each time she looked at Lily and saw her tiny hand curled inside his much larger one, or saw the way her daughter's face lit up when Michael crouched down to play with her, Emma felt her resolve weaken. Lily adored him almost instantly, and it terrified Emma more than it comforted her. How could she allow her child to grow attached to a man who had already proven capable of walking away? And yet how could she deny her daughter the chance to know her father, a man who was now fighting so hard to make up for his mistakes? The guilt Michael carried seeped into every conversation they had. He confessed to nights when he lay awake replaying the moment in the hospital, wishing he had stayed by her side, admitting that the wealth and success he had chased meant nothing when measured against the absence of Emma and the child he hadn't known existed. Emma listened, sometimes in silence, sometimes with anger flaring in her voice as she reminded him that no confession could erase the years of loneliness. But she also noticed the sincerity in his eyes, the way he no longer spoke like a man who believed he was untouchable. He was raw, stripped of the certainty that once made him unbearable, and that vulnerability unsettled her almost as much as it moved her. There were days when Michael insisted on helping, even when Emma tried to refuse. He repaired the leaking faucet in her kitchen, replaced the broken latch on Lily's bedroom window, and carried heavy bags from the market as though determined to shoulder every burden she had learned to carry alone. At first she bristled, seeing his actions as intrusions into the independence she had fought for, but gradually she realized he was not trying to control her life, he was trying to show her that she did not have to carry the weight by herself anymore. That realization scared her more than she expected. For so long her survival had depended on her own strength, on the belief that no one else could be trusted to stand by her. Letting him back in meant risking the collapse of everything she had built if he chose to walk away again. The hardest moments came at night, after Lily was asleep and Emma found herself alone with her thoughts. She would sit by the window, staring at the quiet street below, and replay Michael's words in her head. He said he wanted to be part of their lives, that he was ready to change, that he couldn't undo the past but he could fight for the future. Sometimes she caught herself imagining what it might be like to believe him, to let him back into her heart, to wake up one day without the constant ache of doing everything alone. Then she would remember the sound of his voice in that hospital room, the finality of his words, "It's over," and the hope she felt would wither into fear again. Michael, for his part, seemed to sense her turmoil. He never pushed too hard, never forced her to give answers she wasn't ready to give. Instead, he built his case slowly, through patience, through presence, through the simple act of being there when she least expected it. He attended Lily's small preschool performance, sitting quietly in the back row, his eyes shining as he watched his daughter stumble through a song with the other children. He carried Lily on his shoulders through the park, her laughter echoing in the air while Emma walked beside them, torn between joy at seeing her daughter so happy and dread at how fragile that joy might be if it was taken away. Little by little, Emma began to acknowledge that his actions were not fleeting. He was not disappearing after a week or a month. He was weaving himself into their daily lives, into the fabric of the family she had tried to hold together on her own. And though every step forward left her vulnerable, she could not deny the quiet truth forming in her heart: Michael was not simply asking for forgiveness. He was trying to earn it, piece by piece, and though the wound of his absence still throbbed, Emma was beginning to wonder if healing was possible. The fragile balance Emma had managed to find began to unravel on a night that should have been ordinary. She had just finished another long shift at the cafe, and Lily was already asleep in her little bed, clutching her worn stuffed rabbit. Emma sat at the table with a cup of tea, the bill spread out in front of her like a battlefield she could never win. Her eyes burned with fatigue, but her heart sank lower when she heard the knock at the door. It wasn't the familiar steady knock of Michael, who had begun stopping by more frequently, offering quiet company and gentle persistence. This sound was harder, sharper, a demand rather than a request. Emma froze, every nerve in her body telling her not to answer, but before she could react again the knock came louder, followed by a voice she had hoped never to hear again. "Emma, you owe me. You can't hide forever." The words slithered through the thin door, the voice belonging to a man she had once borrowed money from in a moment of desperation. He had given her just enough to pay the hospital bills, but the interest he demanded was more than she could ever manage. For 2 years she had done everything she could to avoid him, to scrape by, to pretend he would forget. But men like him never forgot. Emma felt her hands tremble as she gathered herself, standing slowly, careful not to wake Lily. She whispered a quiet prayer that the man would go away, but the pounding at the door only grew louder. When she finally opened it a crack, his face appeared in the dim light of the hallway. His smile was cruel, his eyes glinting with satisfaction at her fear. "It's time to pay what you owe," he sneered, his gaze drifting past her shoulder as if searching for something to use against her. Then his eyes narrowed, and his tone shifted. "Or maybe I'll take something else. That little girl of yours, she might fetch more than you think." The threat sliced through Emma, stealing the breath from her lungs. She slammed the door shut with all her strength, bolting it as her heart pounded against her ribs. She leaned against the wood, shaking uncontrollably, tears burning her eyes as she slid to the floor. The following morning Michael appeared as he often did, carrying groceries in one hand and Lily's favorite muffins in the other. He immediately noticed the tension in Emma's face, the way her eyes darted to the door as if expecting another knock. When she finally broke down and told him what had happened, every muscle in his body stiffened with anger. The calm and polished man Emma remembered from years ago was gone, replaced by someone fierce and unyielding. "He threatened you? He threatened Lily?" Michael's voice was low but filled with a rage that chilled her. For a moment she saw the power he wielded in the business world, the ruthlessness that had made him a millionaire, now burning with a different purpose. Emma tried to insist that she would handle it, that she had survived this long and could keep surviving, but Michael wouldn't listen. "This isn't just about you anymore," he said, his eyes locked on hers. "He threatened our daughter. And I will not let anyone touch her." The word stunned Emma, not only because of the ferocity behind them but because he had claimed Lily as his own without hesitation. For the first time, she saw not a man weighed down by guilt but a father determined to protect his family. Over the next few days Michael moved swiftly, using resources Emma had never dreamed of. He made calls that shut doors to the man who threatened her, ensured debts were paid in ways she didn't fully understand, and placed guards outside her building without asking for permission. At first Emma resisted, feeling her independence slipping away, but as she watched Lily sleep peacefully without fear of someone breaking down the door, she felt relief she hadn't known in years. Still, the guilt gnawed at her. She hated that her mistakes, her desperation from years ago, had brought danger so close to her child. The final confrontation came one evening when the man tried once more to press his claim, demanding more than Emma could give. This time Michael was waiting. The exchange was brief and brutal, not in violence but in power. Michael made it clear with cold precision that if the man valued his future, he would never come near Emma or Lily again. His words were sharp enough to slice away any lingering threat, his influence undeniable. When it was over, Michael returned to Emma's apartment, his hands still shaking from the adrenaline. Emma had watched the whole ordeal unfold with a mixture of fear and awe. The man who had once abandoned her in the darkest moment of her life now stood before her as a shield, unflinching in the face of danger. She wanted to hate him for stepping into her world with such force, for taking control in ways that left her breathless, but when she saw the way he knelt beside Lily's bed afterward, brushing a stray lock of hair from her forehead and whispering promises of safety, her heart cracked open in ways she didn't expect. That night, long after the threat had been silenced, Emma sat across from Michael at the small kitchen table. The silence between them was thick, heavy with unspoken words. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight of his guilt mixed with the fire of his determination. He looked at her as though he had something to say but feared she wasn't ready to hear it. And in that moment Emma realized the truth she had been avoiding. No matter how hard she tried to keep him out, he was no longer a man from her past. He had become part of her present, part of the fragile safety she had fought for, and maybe, just maybe, part of the future she dared to imagine. Michael sat across from Emma at the worn kitchen table, the dim light from the single overhead bulb casting shadows across his face, and for the first time in years he looked as though he had nothing left to hide behind. The walls that had once made him appear untouchable, his wealth, his power, his relentless control, had crumbled, and what remained was a man stripped raw by regret. He watched her with a kind of desperate silence, his fingers tapping anxiously against the table before he finally stilled them, as if realizing that even the smallest sound could break the fragile air between them. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of 2 years of silence and shame. He told her he had been a coward, that he had chosen the easier path the night in the hospital, walking away instead of facing the unbearable thought of losing her. He admitted that every success, every deal, every fortune he had built since then had been nothing more than an empty shell without her and without the child he hadn't known existed. His confession wasn't polished or rehearsed, it spilled from him unevenly, words cracking under the strain of honesty he wasn't used to sharing. Emma listened without interrupting, her hands folded tightly in her lap, though her chest rose and fell with the tremor of emotions she could no longer hold back. Anger still lived in her, anger at the choices he had made, anger at the nights she had cried alone while carrying their daughter, anger at the years he had missed. Yet beneath the anger there was also sorrow, and sorrow was far more dangerous. Sorrow reminded her of the love she once carried for him, of the dreams they had abandoned, of the fragile hope she had buried so deeply she believed it would never resurface. As Michael spoke, she felt those old wounds open, not with the sharp sting of fresh pain, but with the aching throb of something that had never fully healed. He leaned forward, his eyes locked on hers, and there was no arrogance in them now, only fear, the fear of losing her again. He told her that protecting her and Lily had awakened something he thought he had lost, a part of himself he didn't know how to claim before. He said he wasn't asking for forgiveness because forgiveness was too great a gift to demand, he was only asking for the chance to prove that he could be the man she needed, the father their daughter deserved. His voice broke as he admitted how much it hurt to hear Lily laugh and know he hadn't been there for her first smile, how he saw in her eyes both the reflection of his mistakes and the possibility of redemption. Emma wanted to push him away, to remind him that words were not enough, but as she opened her mouth to speak, her throat closed, and tears burned behind her eyes. She rose abruptly from the table, pacing the small kitchen, her arms wrapped around herself as though holding her body together. She told him that trust was not something she could hand back like a forgotten possession, that love was not a door she could simply reopen after years of silence. She told him that every part of her feared letting him in again, because if he left a second time, it would destroy not only her but also their daughter, and she could not let Lily experience that kind of abandonment. Michael stood then, crossing the small space between them, his movements careful as though he knew any wrong step would send her retreating into herself again. He didn't touch her at first, didn't force his way past her defenses, but he spoke quietly, telling her he understood the risks, that he knew he didn't deserve another chance, but he would spend the rest of his life proving he was worthy of one. He said he couldn't erase the past, but he could build something in the present, something that might one day heal the scars they both carried. His eyes glistened as he finally whispered that he still loved her, that he had never stopped, and that he had been too blind to see that love was not something to fear but something to fight for. Emma's body shook with sobs she had kept buried for too long, and before she could stop herself, she let the tears fall, her head bowing as she tried to hide them. Michael hesitated for only a moment before he reached out, gently touching her hand, and the warmth of his skin against hers broke down the last barrier she had been clinging to. She didn't fall into his arms or forgive him with a single gesture, but she allowed herself to stand there with him, her tears mixing with his silence, both of them suspended in a fragile moment that felt like the first step towards something new. In that kitchen, surrounded by unpaid bills and the soft sound of Lily breathing in the other room, Emma realized that love was not about perfection or certainty. It was about survival, about enduring even when the world threatened to break you apart, and about daring to believe that broken things could be mended. Michael's confession didn't erase the past, but it carved out a space for possibility, and though fear still held her heart tightly, Emma felt the faintest flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back from the ruins. The months that followed did not pass in silence or perfection but in slow, uneven steps that felt both fragile and unshakable at the same time. Emma did not wake one morning and decide to forgive Michael, and Michael did not expect her to. Instead, he showed up every day with a quiet determination that slowly wove itself into the fabric of their lives. He walked Lily to school with Emma, carrying her tiny backpack as though it were a treasure. He fixed the squeaky floorboard in the hallway, not because Emma asked, but because he noticed her tripping on it. He stayed late when Lily had nightmares, sitting by her bed until her small fingers relaxed around his hand, and he looked at her as if each moment was a gift he never thought he would be allowed to touch. Emma watched all of this with cautious eyes, waiting for the moment the facade would crack, but it never did. Day after day, he stayed, and the fear that he would disappear again began to soften under the weight of his persistence. There were arguments, of course. There were nights when Emma shouted at him, unleashing years of pent-up pain, reminding him of everything he had missed, and Michael stood still and took it, never raising his voice, never retreating into pride. He listened, and when the storm passed, he told her again and again that he was not leaving. At first she doubted, then she tested him, pushing him away only to see if he would return, and each time he did. For the first time in years, Emma began to understand that forgiveness was not a single act but a series of choices, built over time like bricks laid carefully, until one day a foundation stood strong enough to carry the weight of love again. The moment Emma realized her heart had shifted came unexpectedly on a rainy afternoon. She returned home to find Michael sitting on the living room floor with Lily, both of them surrounded by paper crowns and markers. Lily was laughing so hard she could barely breathe as Michael wore a crooked crown decorated with glitter and stickers, his suit jacket discarded on the chair and his sleeves rolled up as if the world of boardrooms and deals did not exist. Emma stood quietly in the doorway, watching the two people she loved most, and for the first time she allowed herself to imagine a life that was not just survival but joy. She felt tears sting her eyes, but they weren't the heavy tears of grief anymore. They were the kind that came when a wound began to heal. When Michael asked her to marry him, it wasn't with grand gestures or fireworks. He waited until a quiet evening when Lily had fallen asleep and the two of them sat on the couch, their shoulders touching in a silence that felt natural. He took her hand, and his voice trembled as he admitted that he still carried the guilt of leaving but wanted to spend every day proving that he would never leave again. He pulled out a simple ring, nothing flashy, nothing meant to impress, only a symbol of what he had rebuilt with her. Emma's breath caught as she looked at him, and though fear still lingered, she felt something stronger rise to the surface: trust. For the first time she said yes, not out of weakness or longing, but out of the quiet certainty that love had survived. The wedding was small, held in a sunlit garden outside the city. Emma wore a modest white dress that fluttered in the breeze, and Lily, dressed in her own little gown, carried the rings with a seriousness that made everyone smile. Michael stood at the altar, his eyes never leaving Emma as she walked toward him, and when he took her hands, there was no hesitation, no shadow of the man who had once run away. His vows were simple, promises not of perfection but of presence, of choosing her every day, of being the father their daughter deserved. Emma's voice broke as she spoke her own vows, not because she doubted but because she finally understood that the strength she had built alone did not have to vanish when shared. As they kissed, sealing their vows, Emma felt the weight of the past begin to fall away. The words he had spoken in the hospital, words that had haunted her every night, no longer echoed in her mind with the same cruelty. They had transformed into something else, not an ending but a beginning. She realized that love had not been destroyed that night, it had been tested, broken, and rebuilt into something stronger, something unshakable. Later, at the small reception, Emma watched as Michael lifted Lily into his arms and spun her around, her laughter filling the air like music. The sight left her breathless because it was everything she had once believed impossible, a family whole again, forged not from perfection but from scars that had finally learned how to heal. In that moment, Emma knew with a certainty she had never felt before that this was not a fragile dream waiting to be shattered. This was their reality. This was their forever.